How many dreams can one family bury before the earth feels heavier than hope? In the years after the guns fell silent, after the Union flags waved, and promises of freedom filled the air, something else took root, a bitter shadow that stretched. Across the South, the era was supposed to be about new beginnings, about justice, about the promise that chains and whips would no longer define a life. But for too many, especially black families, it was the beginning of a new kind of struggle, quiet, cruel, relentless. Welcome, I'm Mark Joie, and this is Injustice Browning. If you haven't already, make sure you hit subscribe because these stories need to be told. They need to be heard. Drop a comment below if you've ever felt the weight of history pressing on your shoulders. It's heavy, isn't it? In a small, worn-down town somewhere deep in the South, a family sits at the edge of a dusty dirt road. Their cabin is barely standing, its wooden walls scarred from years of storms, its roof patched up with bits of scrap. The father, James, tries to hold himself upright, but his eyes betray the exhaustion of a man who has lost more than he can count. His wife, Ruth, clutches their youngest child close, rocking silently, while the older siblings watch with a mixture of fear and confusion. The news had come in the dead of night. The sheriff, a man who wore his authority like a weapon, knocked on their door. No warnings, no explanations, only orders. James had been accused of speaking out too loudly, of daring to challenge the rules that kept black folks in their place. The family knew what that meant. They had heard the rumors, the stories of men taken in the night and never seen again. James was dragged away, disappearing into the night under the cold gaze of law and custom. Ruth's sobs filled the cabin, shaking the thin walls as her children huddled close. It was more than a man taken, it was a future stolen, a father ripped from the roots of his own blood. This wasn't just one family's tragedy. It was the story of thousands, of millions, a pattern carved into the very soil of America. Reconstruction had promised new rights, new freedoms, but it was quickly replaced by Jim Crow laws that said black bodies were less than human, less than citizens, less than deserving of dignity, separate but equal, lies painted over hate. In the days that followed, Ruth had to become both mother and father. She sold what little they had to feed her children, each transaction a painful reminder of how hard the world had become. She learned to hide her anger behind a mask of calm. Every glance from a white neighbor was a silent threat, every step outside a calculated risk. There was no justice here, no protection. The law was a weapon pointed at black families, wielded by men who saw them as less than nothing. The local courts would hear no pleas. The voices of the oppressed were drowned in a chorus of threats and violence. This was the cold reality, a reality built on fear and silence. But inside the cabin, under the weight of despair, there was still something fierce. Ruth whispered stories to her children, stories of ancestors who survived slavery, who resisted. In their own ways, she told them about the nights when songs rose from the fields, songs that carried hope through the darkness. It was a fragile kind of hope, but it was all they had. Every day was a battle to keep that hope alive, to remind themselves they were more than the labels the world tried to force upon them, that even in chains, their spirits could not be broken. But grief settled in like a heavy fog, creeping into their bones. The loss of James was more than a man gone, it was the loss of safety, of possibility. And this story was just one among many. Black families all across the South were living this same nightmare, loved ones ripped away by unjust laws, lynch mobs, and silent terror. The scars were not just on skin, but deep in the soul, passed down from parent to child, generations carrying the burden of a history that refused to heal. It's easy to think of history as something distant, something in books or museums, but this grief is alive. It breathes in the stories told at kitchen tables, in the songs sung on front porches, in the quiet moments when the world turns away. The pain of the past shapes the present in ways we can't always see. What happened to James and Ruth's family was not a tragic accident. It was the system working exactly as it was designed, a system built to keep black people in chains. Even when those chains were no longer made of iron, the chains became laws, customs, violence, and silence. This is the weight of history, the sorrow that haunts the land long after the bodies are gone. The aching wound carried in the heart of a people who have known loss on a scale few can imagine. But within that sorrow, beneath the pain, there is a quiet strength, a refusal to be erased. Because even when the world says you are less, even when it tries to bury you beneath grief and fear, the spirit fights back. It holds onto the fragments of hope, to the stories that remind us who we are and where we come from. It's a strength forged in fire, tested by injustice, and carried forward by those who refuse to forget. This is just the beginning of a story that stretches across time, a story of grief, yes, but also of resilience, a story that asks us to listen, to feel, and to remember. Because to understand where we are now, we have to understand where we came from, and for Black families like James and Ruth's, that journey has never been easy. The world was cold, brutal, and relentless, but so was the will to survive. And it's in that survival that the true story begins. You ever try to walk through a door that's always slammed shut, not once or twice, but every single day? Imagine that. The world telling you again and again, you don't belong. It's not always loud. Sometimes it's the silence, the glance that shifts away, the opportunities that vanish before you even get close. This is the story of those invisible walls, built to keep people out, keep them down, keep them invisible. Meet Samuel. He's a man in his 30s, living in a city where the neon lights promise progress, but don't shine on everyone. Samuel works hard. He wakes before dawn, dresses sharp, and shows up ready to do his best. But every job he applies for comes with the same excuse: we're looking for someone else, not quite the right fit. The reasons change, but the answer is the same: no. Samuel lives in a neighborhood marked on every map as colored. It's a small pocket, squeezed between industrial zones and white neighborhoods that close their doors tight. The streets are cracked, the buildings weathered, but the people here hold onto their pride with clenched fists. Still, even this place feels like a cage. Police patrol the streets with suspicion baked into their eyes. They stop and question Samuel more times than he can count. Sometimes they say nothing, just watch, waiting for a reason to strike. He remembers the time they pulled him over on a quiet Sunday afternoon. No cause, no warning, just a cold demand to get out of the car. His heart pounding, hands trembling. He did everything right, but one wrong word, one wrong look, it could have been worse. It wasn't the first time, and Samuel knows it won't be the last. At work, things aren't much better. He's a janitor in a large office building downtown, a place where the people he cleans up after barely notice him. They don't see Samuel's hopes or his dreams, just the mop in his hands. The company pays him less than others in similar jobs. Raises are rare, respect almost never. But it's more than just money or respect. It's the way the world tells Samuel he's less than, less capable, less deserving. It's in the way his ideas get ignored, his presence minimized, a daily erosion of dignity that builds a quiet fire inside. Still, Samuel refuses to break. He talks to his children about the value of education, the importance of standing tall. He tells them about their history, about the people who fought before them. But inside, the frustration burns. How do you teach hope when the world keeps tearing it down, when every step forward feels like walking uphill against a storm? His wife, Clara, watches him sometimes, seeing the strain, but knowing better than to push too hard. They fight quietly, not about love, but about the weight they both carry. Bills pile up, opportunities slip through their fingers, and the future feels uncertain. Clara reminds Samuel to hold on, to keep fighting for their family. But some nights, when the house is dark and the city quiet, Samuel lets his anger slip out bare and raw. It's a slow kind of rage, the kind that builds from being ignored and dismissed, from seeing your people treated like outsiders in their own home. Samuel knows it's not just him, it's a whole generation people pushed to the margins, kept in line by invisible hands. Sometimes he wonders if things will ever change, if the world will ever see him, not as a problem or a stereotype, but as a man with worth and dreams. But then he thinks about the marches on the news, the voices rising in protest, the slow grind of laws bending just a little, and that gives him a flicker of hope. Still, hope isn't enough. Samuel knows the fight is hard because the enemy isn't always clear. It's not just the man who refuses to hire him or the cop who watches him with suspicion. It's the system, the habits, the assumptions, the quiet agreements that keep Black people locked out of full opportunity. He's learned to navigate the world with caution, to smile when he wants to scream, to keep his head down but his eyes open. Survival is a skill one Samuel has mastered, but sometimes he wonders what survival costs. In the small moments when a store clerk ignores his greeting or a teacher underestimates his child, Samuel feels testing of those invisible chains. They're not loud. They don't break bones. But they wear you down. They say you're less. Over and over, until sometimes you start to believe it. But Samuel won't give them that victory. Not now. Not ever. He carries the anger, yes, but more than anger, he carries defiance. Because beneath the frustration is a spirit that refuses to be crushed, a belief that someday the doors will open wide, that the world will see him, his family, his community, for who they really are. This is the everyday battle of fight fought not on battlefields, but in offices, on streets, in classrooms, and at kitchen tables. It's a fight for respect, for dignity, for the chance to be seen. And while the walls may stand today, Samuel knows they won't stand forever, because every day, in every small act of resistance, those invisible chains are tested, and the fight for justice continues. ChatGPT said, there comes a moment when silence is no longer an option, when the weight of injustice presses so hard, you feel the ground beneath you shake not from the earth, but from the power of a people refusing to be quiet. The civil rights era was full of those moments, small sparks that ignited into roaring flames. It was a time when courage took many shapes, the marchers in the streets, the lawyers in the courts, the mothers holding their children close while praying for safety. This is the story of Clara Johnson. She wasn't famous, no statues or headlines, or her name, but she was one of the many who dared to stand up, to say no to the cruel rules that told her and her community to stay in their place. Clara was a school teacher in a small town, teaching black children in a rundown, overcrowded school that barely had enough books. Every day, she looked into the eyes of those children, eyes full of questions, dreams, and sometimes fear. She knew that education was more than reading and math. It was a key to freedom, a way out of the system that tried to trap them. But Clara's fight went beyond the classroom. She joined local groups that organized protests, voter registration drives, and legal challenges. It was dangerous work. Police would show up, sometimes beating protesters, sometimes arresting them on flimsy charges. The threat of violence hung over every march, every meeting, every step forward. One afternoon, Clara stood with a crowd of determined faces, holding signs that demanded equal rights, equal access to voting, to jobs, to education. The air was thick with tension. The line between hope and fear was thin. They were met with jeers and worse hoses, dogs, clubs. But Clara didn't flinch. She felt the sting of the water, the yells, the hate, but she stood her ground, because she knew that every step back meant the struggle wasn't over. Every act of violence was a sign that change was close. The victories didn't come easy. Sometimes the courts ruled against them. Sometimes the promises made by politicians were broken. But slowly, the tide began to turn. Laws were challenged. Segregation in schools was declared unconstitutional. Voting barriers were lowered. Clara's husband, Marcus, was a lawyer who worked tirelessly behind the scenes. He represented those arrested for protesting. He fought cases that would set important precedents. His office was cramped, filled with stacks of legal papers and a constant hum of determination. Together, Clara and Marcus embodied the resilience of a generation refusing to accept no for an answer. Their sacrifices were many. Nights spent apart while Marcus worked on cases. Threats left on their doorstep. Friends lost to violence or fear. But what kept them going was a belief stronger than any weapon that justice was possible. Clara often said, "We are standing on the shoulders of those who came before us, and one day, those who come after will stand on ours." That wasn't empty hope. It was a promise forged through struggle. The community around them grew stronger, bound by shared pain and purpose. People who once lived in silence found their voices. Churches became meeting places. Homes became safe havens. The fight was not just legal, it was deeply personal, a movement of hearts and minds. There were moments of light when a black child could finally attend a better school, when a black voter's name was accepted without question, when a community came together to celebrate small victories that felt monumental. These moments were proof that resilience could bend the arc of history. Yet, the fight was far from over. Backlash came swiftly. Violent groups attacked activists. Bombings tore through neighborhoods. The price of hope was steep, but Clara and Marcus held firm. This story is about more than one family or one town. It's about a generation that carried the torch, passing it forward through tears and sweat and blood. It's about the power of standing together, knowing that no matter how brutal the storm, the dawn would come. Clara looked into the faces of her students and saw the future she was helping to shape with every lesson, every protest, every act of courage. Her story is a reminder that resilience is not a quiet thing. It's loud, it's fierce, and it's unstoppable. And so, the fight for justice marched on, fueled by hope, sacrifice, and the unbreakable will to claim what was always theirs. Because change is not given, it is taken, and in that taking, there is power. ChatGPT said, "They say things have changed, that the world is different now, but sometimes, when you look closely, you see how much stays the same. The chains have shifted, no longer heavy iron bars, but threads so fine they almost disappear. Invisible walls, quiet rules, that slow, grinding weight that presses on the soul." Meet Jasmine. She's a college student, bright and driven, with dreams bigger than the city she lives in. She's studying law because she wants to fight the very systems that still try to hold her back. But even as she walks the halls of her university, she feels the old wounds echoing in new ways. It's not just the big things, though those still exist. Police pulling over her friends without reason, stories on the news about another name, added to a long list. It's the small things that chip away at her every day, the teacher who calls on others first, the landlord who raises her rent because of where she lives, the manager who doubts her skills without cause. Microaggressions, tiny moments that, stacked one on top of another, become walls just as real as the ones before. Jasmine's mother, Angela, works two jobs. She grew up hearing stories from her own mother about what it meant to live under Jim Crow, about the marches and the fights. Angela sees the world through those stories, but also through her own struggle, making ends meet, facing the glass ceilings that keep her from rising, watching her children deal with a world that says, "You're better now, but you're still less." There's frustration, sure, anger too, because progress feels slow, sometimes almost invisible. The system hasn't erased the old scars. It just learned how to hide them better, and that's the hardest part, knowing the fight isn't over, but feeling exhausted just the same. Jasmine thinks about the protests, the movements that fill the streets with voices demanding change. She joins in, hopeful but wary. Hopeful because she believes in the power of people coming together, wary because she knows the backlash is still there, subtle, hidden, but just as damaging. The economic gap is wide. Black families still struggle more than most, burdened by generations of denied opportunities. It's in the homes with peeling paint, in the schools that lack resources, in the jobs that pay less for the same work. The promises made decades ago, equal rights, equal chances, often feel like words on paper, but Jasmine holds onto her dignity. She refuses to let the world define her worth. She surrounds herself with friends and mentors who lift each other up, who understand the weight they carry, but also the strength they hold. She studies the history that brought her here, not as a burden, but as a map showing the path others carved, so she can walk it with eyes wide open. She asks herself questions that don't have easy answers. How do you heal when the past never really leaves you? How do you build when the foundations are cracked? What does justice look like in a world still learning to see? Her story is not just hers. It's a shared story, a reflection of a legacy that doesn't disappear overnight. It's about acknowledging pain without letting it break you, about recognizing the shadows but stepping into the light anyway. And in that tension between history and hope, Jasmine finds her truth. The truth that resilience is not just about surviving, but about pushing forward with fierce clarity. That progress is not a straight line, but a winding road filled with setbacks and breakthroughs. She knows the fight continues not just in the streets or the courts, but in everyday moments, in choosing to speak up when it's easier to stay quiet, in seeing herself as worthy, even when the world tries to tell her otherwise. This is the modern shadow, a world shaped by the past, but still demanding change today. It's a reminder that the struggle is ongoing, that justice is never fully done, but also that in awareness, reflection, and community, there is power. Jasmine's story is a call to remember, to resist, and to rise, because even in the darkest shadows, light finds a way through. They say victory tastes sweetest when it's been fought for in the dirt, under the weight of every insult, every setback, every scar that tries to mark you as less. This is a story of that kind of victory, not the kind that comes easy or without cost, but the kind that burns deep, fierce, and real. It's about a man named Elijah, a veteran, a fighter, a man who refused to be erased. Elijah grew up in a neighborhood that knew struggle all too well. His father worked long hours. His mother kept the house together from a young age. Elijah learned that the world outside their door didn't always want to see him win. It whispered that his dreams were too big, that his voice wasn't strong enough. But Elijah listened to a different voice, the one inside that said, "You are more." He joined the military, not because he wanted to fight, but because he wanted a chance to prove that he could stand tall, that he could serve, that he could come back and change the story. War left its marks on his body, on his mind, but it also gave him something harder to find, a sense of purpose and strength. Coming home was no relief. The same society he fought for still treated him like a stranger. Job offers turned cold. Doors slammed shut. Veterans' benefits that were promised seemed just out of reach. The system he defended felt like it had forgotten him, but Elijah refused to let that break him. He turned to business, opening a small community store, a place where people could find work, where kids could dream, where the neighborhood could gather and rebuild. It wasn't easy. Banks hesitated. Investors doubted. Racism showed up in quiet ways, contracts denied, permits delayed. But Elijah pushed forward with the grit of a man who had seen worse and survived. His store became a beacon, a symbol that even after the worst, something good could grow. People came to him for advice, for support, for hope. Elijah gave it freely. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a leader, a reminder that strength isn't just muscle or money. It's hard. Then came the day when the city planned to demolish the neighborhood for development, threatening to uproot families, erase histories. Elijah stood in front of the council, voice steady, eyes blazing. He spoke of the community's value, of its stories, its people. The fight was fierce, threats, legal battles, intimidation. But Elijah's spirit was unbreakable. In the end, the neighborhood stood, plans changed, the community rallied. It was more than a win over property lines. It was a declaration, a statement that Black lives, Black history, Black futures matter. Elijah's victory wasn't just his own. It was everyone's who had ever been told they didn't belong. But he knew this wasn't the end. The scars remained visible and hidden. The work to heal and rebuild was ongoing. Elijah often said, "We carry the past with us, but we don't have to be chained by it." His story reminds us that triumph is complicated. It's not a clean, easy moment of glory. It's messy, it's painful, it's full of hard truths, but it's also full of hope. Because when people refuse to be silenced, when they claim their space with dignity and pride, change happens. Elijah's life is a call to stand firm, to fight hard, to build community, and to honor the struggles of those who came before by making sure the future is better. It's a reminder that survival is just the beginning. The journey continues, and it demands all of us vigilant, united, and hopeful. Because in every scar is a story of strength, and in every victory, a promise. We will not be erased.